So today we're going to take a look at threats specific to manufacturing that's spilling over into biotech and food production as well. So real quick on the agenda, we're going to describe the problems specific to manufacturing, hit on some network behavioral anomaly detection definitions so that we understand the context of what I'm talking about. We'll look at how to protect those things that are being targeted for theft inside of manufacturing. Look at the risk of insider threat and how to address that. Also the importance of audit trails for doing incident response on the tail end of an event. And time permitting, we'll look at StealthWatch as a solution in these areas. So real quick on the problem statement, there are two major areas of risk or target that affect manufacturing that don't really apply to a lot of other industries. Intellectual property, design documents, those types of things, blueprints, are big money, and that's been true for as long as there has been manufacturing. Not just in the things being delivered, but the ways that different manufacturers are able to create efficiencies around manufacturing. How can you reduce the amount of time, the amount of cost, and of course that has an impact on the competitiveness of the products being delivered. On the other side, one thing that has become increasingly important is protecting M&A data. Manufacturers by nature have to acquire smaller organizations, either to get the efficiencies that small organization has, acquire their blueprints, deal with the changes in the market. So acquisitions, more so than mergers, but acquisitions are a routine part of life inside of manufacturing. And if you can imagine a small organization that's being targeted for acquisition, it's the end game for them. It's the biggest thing that's going to happen in their lives. They can't be acquired a second time, and as a result, we're seeing acquisition targets increasingly attacking, not necessarily through hacking mechanisms, but through social engineering, through bribery, to encourage someone inside of the acquiring organization to provide competitive intelligence that can be used to make the acquisition more profitable for the organization. So we've seen that several times in the last couple of years with data being stolen, so that when you go to the negotiating table, the acquisition target has more useful information or has a better negotiating point than the acquiring organization. Of course, that has a big impact on the bottom line of that acquisition. So who are attacking? Who are the aggressors in this scenario? The first and probably the least important are the activists, the anonymous of the world, and those that are would want to hurt manufacturing. We've seen this a couple of times in the last few years where an executive says something that they shouldn't have said, or manufacturing processes are aggravating the activists, and they feel that they need to have a conversation about it, and normally those conversations are stealing information and publishing it to shame the manufacturer, to shame the organization, or a denial of service to hurt their bottom line. So that is a thing that happens. We see that, but a lot less scary than really the rest of these. Competitors and acquisition targets are an issue inside of manufacturing. Those that want the blueprints, want the information to allow and enable them to be more competitive. Maybe they're not even stealing the blueprint, but knowing what the blueprint is would allow them to create something to leapfrog over the targeted organization. We have seen nation-state attacks against manufacturers. So the PLA attribution from Mandy a couple of years ago saw China stealing intellectual property from manufacturers to make Chinese-based manufacturers more competitive globally. And so that's a known problem that we have in different geopolitical situations. And then you have the insider threat that's someone that is working for the organization is inside, and they have a number of reasons to hurt their employer, or hurt the organization. It could be money, could be ideology, if they're upset, it could be disgruntlement, could be that they're being bribed, or that they have a geopolitical leaning towards one of these others. So when we look at those aggressors, and then we start looking at some of the vulnerabilities that manufacturing have, one of them is the porous access to data. In different things like PCI scopes or even HIPAA, you can more granularly control who has access to data. But the intellectual property, whether it's blueprints, formulas, whether it's M&A data, people have to interact with that data to collect it, to catalog it, to improve it, to create next year's design. And because of that access, it's difficult to control and monitor how that information is being used. You also have partners, distributors, contractors that are accessing the data in some manner. And you have, in global manufacturing, you have geo-distribution of those teams, folks all over the world accessing that same set of data. That becomes more of an issue, or a compounded issue, when we look at how diverse manufacturing networks are. You have all the problems that the other enterprise have with BYOD and laptops, mobile devices, diverse types of endpoints. But you also have manufacturing devices that may be running proprietary code, may be running code that's out of support, maybe running in recent months on Windows XP. That has reached end of life and is support through Microsoft. And how do you deal with all of those different types of devices? Those devices are connected and largely able to communicate with each other with the typical Internet of Things type of problems. You have many types of users, more so than we'd see in many other enterprise organizations. The engineers, the folks on the floor, and there's contractors and the rest. There's a lot of issues there. Patching and supporting these small batch or limited use applications is much harder than the more broadly used applications. So, and there's not a lot of guidance on how to harden these devices. Because of that, you have a lot of different ways to get into the network. You can break in through something that's doing welding. A welding machine might be a way to get it deep into the network, and then controlling that access is the challenge. So in addressing the detection piece, I'm going to go over network behavioral anomaly detection as a school of thought. And NBAD is IDS, intrusion detection. Dr. Dorothy Denning, when she coined the term IDS in 1986, broke up the schools of detection into signature, anomaly, and behavioral based, and we'll look at how that applies in a second. But network behavioral anomaly detection is not so concerned with what is in a packet, but how many packets of that type there are. You're counting a lot of things. And so when you start counting, for instance, how many bytes does an engineer normally access from the blueprint data in a monitored period of time. So you calculate all of the engineers and create a mathematical baseline for what's normal, and then you start counting each user's access and compare it to that baseline. And so that's, in a nutshell, how NBAD works. And because we're counting packets, NetFlow, because it has the counters in the NetFlow export, became a really great source of this data, because we could essentially convert the entire network into a surveillance probe for doing this type of monitoring. Allows us to see the east-west conversations, not just the things going across choke points. However, sometimes NBAD or even MBA, which is similar to NBAD or a subset of NBAD, are lumped into NetFlow security tools. And just because something does NetFlow, it doesn't mean it's processing at an NBAD level. If you're not familiar with NetFlow, it's metadata of communications going across an interface. NetFlow properly was invented by Cisco. NetFlow version 9 is, there's an informational RFC listed here, 3950. IPFix, which is sometimes called NetFlow 10 or NetFlow version 10, really is the open source standard for meta logging. So NetFlow isn't SFlow. SFlow is one out of N packets. NetFlow is a log entry about a communication crossing an interface, or router switches, a switch, or something along those lines. Other manufacturers, aside from Cisco, have their own brand of NetFlow that's, from a PCAP level, very much the same as NetFlow, but JFlow from Juniper, CFlow D, and the rest that are listed there. But here on the lower section, you can see it's just the time it started the interface. It's off this IP to this IP over this port to this port. So there's a lot of fields that you can put into NetFlow. Just think of it in general terms as a meta log of communications. So I mentioned a minute ago that Dr. Denning came up with 3 ways of detecting any type of breach, whether it's on the network or on the endpoint. And when we tend to think about detection, we think about signature-based detection. And signature-based detection is when we look at the object before it enters the subject, before it enters the target. And so, for instance, a signature-based IDS is looking for a string of patterns. If you see those patterns, you know that packet is associated with a SQL injection attack against CVE, XYZ, whatever it is. In the physical security realm, this would be akin to looking for, if you run something through an X-ray machine, you're looking for something that looks like a bomb. It has certain patterns to it. Or in even older times, if you're feeding someone poison and you can smell the poison or see the poison, you're inspecting the object. Behavioral-based detection is once the object has been consumed by the target, you watch the behaviors of the target looking for known bad behaviors. So in that oldest scenario, you would give the wine to the cup holder or the cup bearer for the king. He would drink the wine, and then you would watch him to see if he did something that's known bad, like dying, passing out, choking, those types of things. And then from that, you're able to determine that the object must have been bad because the behavior that occurred in the target subsequently was also bad. And so in a network perspective, sandboxing does this. You put a file inside of the sandbox, and you watch what happens when the file is executed. From a network perspective, what you're doing is you're looking for known bad behaviors, like scanning the network, trying to break through a firewall, using policies or protocols that shouldn't be used. Those types of things that are known bad. And so you have malware sandboxing that does this, you have NBAD that does this, host intrusion prevention systems do some level of this, and security event logging solutions like SIMs are designed to do this as well, looking for things like machines on the network that are brute forcing passwords or doing some other activity that is a known bad behavior. Anomaly-based detection is similar to behavioral-based detection in that you're watching the behavior of the victim, but you're watching the behavior of the victim against known good behavior. So in the physical security realm, if someone always shows up at work at 7 o'clock in the morning, but then all of a sudden they show up at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock or the next day, that's anomalous because it's deviating from what is known to be normal. And on the network side, that's if desktops communicate to the email servers over POP3 all day long, then all of a sudden one of them starts talking over SSH or doing something that's just strange. So the construction of the packets are different. It's collecting too much data. Anything that's mathematically abnormal is really where anomaly fits in. And so when we look at how these things fit together, the way we catch things, the way we write new signatures is through behavioral-based detection. So when a zero-day piece of malware makes it into the network, we might not know what the malware was, but the actions that it does were known. So we analyze that file and create a new signature. And the same thing, Anomaly creates behavioral checks. If there's a new bad behavior that we begin to see on the network or in the host, what happens with anomaly detection is it's a thing that we don't know what it is. We analyze it. We figure out that behavior was attached to data hoarding or data staging or whatever it may be, and we create a behavioral signature. And so that's the life cycle of threat detection. And as I pointed out, as I have here in the way I can only boil down, signature-based detection is the best, most reliable way of catching known exploits. Zero-day is best caught with behavioral-based detection, either sandboxing or network behavioral detection, and then credential abuse. And what I mean by this is where there's nothing to detect. A user is abusing their privilege to do something, like Edward Snowden. He was hired by Booz Allen to work on behalf of the NSA to collect data, or not collect data, but administer the data. And he had to access these machines. But there's a normal amount of data that he would collect, and there's an abnormal amount. So if you look at all of the Booz Allen contractors at the NSA in that similar role, and you look at how much data, it might be 10 megs or 20 megs of data is exchanged in a day. But after he had collected several gigabytes or even close to terabytes of data, that's anomalous. It's mathematically wrong. And there's no other way to detect those types of attacks because you can't throw a flag that he connected to the machine because he's supposed to. So there was no malware used. So there's no malware to detect, either behavioral or otherwise. There's no known bad behavior. He's supposed to upload and download data. And so it's a matter of mathematical deviation here. And so that's when I talk about credential abuse, I mean malware-less attacks. There's no malware, it's authorized users, or so a type of malware that's otherwise undetectable, theoretically. So a challenge you run into inside of behavioral and anomaly detection that you don't have in signature-based detection is that there are many shades of abnormal. You know, I gave the example of the guy that showed up at work at, always shows up at 7, then he shows up at, 7:05. Well, that is anomalous, but you certainly don't call the police at 7:04 when he's not there. When do you do that? At what point is it so mathematically strange? Or maybe there's multiple events that indicate that something is wrong that would lead you to take an action like calling the police or his family or something along those lines. Where signature detection can be very Boolean, if the pattern is matched and you can run some additional checks on it, the output of signature or Boolean-based detection is always green light or red light. It's a logical high or logical low, and 1 or 0, right? But when you're dealing with things that are different shades, an infinite shade of gray, if you will, inside of anomaly detection, you have to have a way to reliably deal with those different shades. When do you alarm people? And so the way that I advocate is using algorithmic detection through indexes or indices. And so you assign an index, and in the case of StealthWatch, we use something called a concern index that's assigned to every entity, every host on the network. And you start out in the monitoring period with a score of 0. And if something is mathematically, abnormal but only slightly abnormal, the host might accumulate a few points or increment the index a few points. If he does something that's radically far from normal, he'll accumulate more points quickly. If he's doing things that are known bad, like scanning the network, as I have up here, or pivoting activity, those points might accumulate very fast. So the cumulative odd behavior gets to a point that, based upon the risk of the host, requires an alarm. So some hosts we'll be more concerned about. So those hosts that have access to intellectual property information or the acquisition information will have a much lower threshold. So maybe at 10,000 points, an alarm is triggered and an incident response is begun. Whereas someone on a quarantined or isolated guest network might have 1 million points or 2 million points as the threshold before we start caring. So that to say, to do that effectively in practice, doing this algorithmic detection, so algorithmic meaning how do we increment the counters, and then these counters being indexes that are compared to the risk of those hosts. So there's a handful of things. This is sort of an exhaustive list. We've talked about some of the things today. Manufacturers also manufacture for governments. I spent time inside of the Department of Defense, and we trusted several different manufacturers to produce hardware for us that would be useful, but if that fell into the hands of other nation states, it could be used against us in a combat situation. So we have state secrets in this, we have competitive information with M&A, we have research and intellectual property, but this data exists somewhere inside of the network. These are the crown jewels. So when I say crown jewels, I mean things we don't want stolen, that we can't have stolen. There's costs along with this. We've sort of already hit on this. Some of these aren't applicable to manufacturing, but criminals want to make money, activists want to shame you, state-sponsored want to improve their geopolitical stance, whether it's against your nation or it's improving the economical competitiveness of their like manufacturers. So inside of monitoring for crown jewels, what we really don't care about the perimeter as much. We do, it's not irrelevant, but what's really important is monitoring the east-west traffic. How are the workstations communicating with the servers? How are the servers communicating with the servers? How is data being accessed? So the first thing we have to do is log and monitor every communication inside the network. And of course, as we brought up, NetFlow is a great way of doing that. I was working with a global manufacturer earlier this month, and we were able to turn on North American monitoring in less than 30 minutes. So to see virtually every conversation happening in North America, whether it's inside the factories or inside of office locations or the rest, we were collecting and analyzing all of that data very quickly just by enabling that on different parts of the network, the routers, the switches, the firewalls. We just flipped on that data and we're able to start analyzing those communications. Once you have the data coming in, to do network behavioral anomaly detection, you have to do something called enclaving. Inside of StealthWatch, we call that host groups. And so you'd create something called crown jewels. You wouldn't call it crown jewels. You'd probably call it design documents or acquisition data. And we would put into these buckets, these enclaves, these host groups, where is the data, which machines house the data, and then we would map out how that information is being accessed. Inside of StealthWatch specifically, we can count every byte that a host is collecting. So and then we compare that to normal. So suspect data hoarding is when a host collects more data than is mathematically acceptable that is mathematically anomalous and compared to the risk. So if we only expected an engineer to touch 50 megs of data in a day and he just downloaded 50 gigabytes of data in a day, that would trigger data hoarding. And it might not be from one source. It might be that he's collecting it from many different sources around the network. The corollary to that is target data hoarding, which is where we're monitoring how much data is being taken off the server. So it's looking at how much information each server is giving to multiple destinations. And this is important when an attacker tries to circumvent monitoring by taking control of many endpoints and using those endpoints sort of as internal bots to go and collect this data, so to circumvent detection. So we look at that. We also look at total data, how much total data is being exchanged between hosts. And then data loss is when a host is counting how many bytes every host sends out of the network, how much information is being exfiltrated over a monitored period of time. The other way to protect the data is validating segmentation. So once you know that this is where the data is, these are the folks that should access the data, these are the machines that are providing support, whether it's pushing patches or doing DNS or something along those lines, to these in-scope machines, the only place we should see data are on these triangles. We'd see it here, actually on this line, they might have to download things from the internet. You'd have these hosts talking, and these hosts talking. And we would baseline what is normal. But before we even baseline what was normal, we would say there should never be any traffic here, and there should never be any traffic here. Note these are logical mappings. We don't really care how the data leaves. I was working with with a customer who had data in a quarantine segment like this, and the attackers were able to steal credentials from an administrator and create a VPN tunnel, an L2TP tunnel, to bypass the segmentation using those stolen credentials. So you don't want to watch for this type of exfiltration at the physical level, at the network level. You want to look at it at a logical level. I don't care how the data goes from here to here. It should never do that. And so we're going to monitor on that, and if it ever happens, if segmentation is ever broken, if policy is ever violated, an alarm would come out of that using what we call a host lock violation or a segmentation violation. And same thing here. And so these have thresholds of 0. And then these do have thresholds, but we're going to baseline what is normal, what's the normal amount of data to go between this in a day. And if that becomes excessive, we're going to alert on that. So not just looking at validating that nothing should happen, but when things should happen, making sure that it stays within the realm of normal, right? That the privileges aren't being abused. And so what that allows us to do is calculate events. This is the segmentation violation from crown jewels authorized to an invalid server. This host, this user, spoke to someone he should not have. And so we're able to trigger those events very quickly. So that's from the crown jewel perspective. When we look at another piece of this is the insider. And when we're talking about the insider, from a computer science perspective, it falls into 3 different buckets. You have the actual human person, and by the way, thanks to my boss, Tom Kennedy, for letting me use his face. He just looks like the perfect insider. But you have the human being that can be compromised. You have their credentials, meaning how they actually communicate with these endpoints, the password, the certificate, however this computer knows that this person is connected to the machine. And then you have the actual machine. And so each one of these can be targeted for exploit by the adversaries. And so when you look at the person, there's everything that's wrong in the human condition can be exploited as a vulnerability to convert this person. So I mentioned the M&A. We just a few months ago was working with a manufacturer who had this issue where someone internally was being bribed to provide information. So that falls under the active vulnerability is financial hardship and greed, and then you just bribe them, give them money. Why go through all the trouble of trying to craft a sophisticated cyber attack when $1,000 or $10,000 worth of bribe will do. But everything else here, fear, loneliness, you can kidnap people, you can take pictures from extortion. So this is not an exhaustive list, but really any way that you can con or manipulate a human being falls into the vulnerability for those inside the network. On the credentials threat, those are normally passwords. Passwords are a horrible way to do authentication, but they're also the most common way. But you can brute force it. We've gone through this scenario. It is very, for weak passwords, with the computation we have today, me and a counterpart built a machine for $380 that can go through 4 million hashes a second trying to crack a password. And so that would, a few years ago would have been very expensive, and now pretty much anyone can crack passwords that aren't, crack hashes, but brute force the password. So it's becoming increasingly easy to do that. And the other thing is we share a lot of information. The human beings share information on Facebook and other social media that help you figure out what their dictionary might be. So you use our personal dictionary. So if you know the person's wife is Sherry, you add Sherry to the dictionary. If you know that they like fishing, you add fishing terms into the dictionary. And so doing a hybrid of social engineer or social media farming, and then building a dictionary there allows you to do it in even a fraction of the time that a brute force would allow. Multi-domain usage of passwords. If someone's using the same password at work that they use on a website on the internet, so you attack the internet thing, the internet website, you do a SQL injection or some other type of attack, and you have their passwords or their hashes, which give you their passwords, and then you retry those passwords on their work credentials. And so we see that increasingly occurring. Keylogger, so analog to digital conversion means, someone is typing it in, so you either just watch them type it in, or someone looking over the cube. You can set up a camera to record these things. GoPros are very cheap, so if you want to steal someone's credential in your office, you can just get an HD or 4K HD camera and just point it at someone's keyboard and record it very simply that way. It's a very cheap exploit for getting to steal credentials. And then the credentials are in transit, in transmission. So I type them in the computer. They're going to go to a server. If you have some compromised point in the middle that can log those credentials before in transit, you can extract those. And so now, instead of having the user do the bad things, you can pose as the user. And by the way, I'm going in the order of the worst possible thing to the worst horrible thing. So, compromising a user gives you a long list of possibilities. There's a shorter list of possibilities when you just have their credentials. And then when you have the endpoint, it's yet a shorter list. But when the endpoint's compromised, it's, the human being downloads something they shouldn't, they click something, they install something they shouldn't. Machines communicate over ports, so you can use those open ports to infect the machines and things like malware worms. Supply chain is something that's come up in the news. As a machine is being shipped to you, it may be compromised, or the installation media may become compromised to put controlware on that machine to beacon out to the end folks. And if you have an insider that also wants to manipulate someone's endpoint, if the guy leaves the machine unlocked, so you have a compromised insider uses his colleague's machine, it looks like the colleague is participating in the attack. So, in these things, I'm always supposed to deliver statistics because that validates it, but some of these statistics are pretty impossible right now because when you deal with insiders, there's no malware to track. If it's actually the real insider, especially a technical insider, he is in a very good position to cover his own tracks and destroy evidence. And they're going to understand, an insider has a better understanding of how, what the response would look like because he's inside, he has access to information that others wouldn't, he knows people and the rest. And there's an increasing availability of tools and information that enables an insider to get away with it, right, to get away with the theft. And, finally, from a law enforcement perspective, it becomes difficult to, unless you're doing some very smart logging, to actually attribute the attack to the human being. How do you know it just wasn't the endpoint that was compromised or that his credentials were stolen? How can you, at a legal level, prove that it was the human being? So that said, some of the statistics are hard. The only thing that I could find that would be useful in this conversation is something from Carnegie Mellon's CERT. And when they looked at the breakdown of the insider threats that were actually detected, so these are the detected insider threats. IT sabotage is the angry guy that blows the thing up when he leaves, so that we'll leave that one off the table for right now. But for someone that's looking for financial gain, so they're being bribed, they can sell the information, that type of thing. 75% of those detected attacks were done with credentials. 85% of those 75 was done with their own credentials. And so almost none of them compromised an account. They weren't using someone else's account, and if they did, it was one of those situations where someone showed up and used the keyboard of someone else. And this was pretty surprising. Almost all of, or 84% of those attackers were non-technical. They were just the guy that would take the bribe and follow instructions. They happened during normal working hours. And same thing on business advantage. So if you have an engineer, a sales guy, that is leaving an organization and going to another organization, they can take competitive information, whether it's the Rolodex information, blueprint information, which is almost always authorized access, almost always their own credentials, and they almost never do anything sophisticated to compromise the account. So it's trusted folks taking stuff and leaving with it. And I see this all the time. So I just downtown Chicago a few weeks ago with an executive taking a lot of data off the network. He triggered suspect data hoarding. We came to find out in the investigation that he was on his way out. So it's very common. Matter of fact, I joke to say that when we see a suspect data hoarding event, you tie it to the user, and then you'll almost every time find their LinkedIn profile recently updated, and they're getting ready to move on. So, a few things, so how do you reduce insider vulnerabilities? How do you reduce the possibility of exploit? So, the human being part is the same things you've been doing in U.S. military, U.S. government forever, because you have to give people access to data to be operational. But things like background checks are probably the only background checks, both ongoing as well as psychological checks, and of course that opens up a whole can of worms on civil liberties and the rest. But those are the concrete things that could be done. Dealing with the credentials, you need to deal with better authentication, two-factor authentication using expiring tokens or certificates or biometrics, or even just changing passwords and making them more complex. And then dealing with the endpoint, things like malware sandboxing, improved policy, a reduction of entry points, all of those things can lead to a reduced vulnerability from the insider threat perspective. A couple of things we do inside of StealthWatch are using identity information from solutions like Cisco's Identity Services Engine or Lancope's Identity Box. We can map the user identities and the MAC addresses to the communications coming off of NetFlow. And there's also some NetFlow devices that can provide user information in the NetFlow export. But from that, in this example, we can see user Ethel was in Atlanta and Boston at basically the same time. And as scary as this is, it's a lot scarier if they're in Detroit and they're in Beijing at the same time. So monitoring for a geographic user anomaly. This is suspect data hoarding. When we mathematically calculate that a host should consume no more than 100 megs of data from the network in a day, based upon his peers, and we observe that he collected 11 gigabytes of data in a day, that's going to trigger suspect data hoarding anomaly. Suspect data loss is very similar. The threshold calculated is 500 megs for data to leave the network for this type of host, but we saw 8.3 gigs of data leave the network going somewhere, and so reason for investigation. Second to last area I'm going to talk about is using audit trails to handle to deal with response and reduce risk. So, for one, if insiders are aware that every communication is being logged, analyzed, and kept, it will reduce the number of incidents of crime happening if they're aware of it. And because they don't like evidence, criminals don't like evidence, they don't like consequences. If they believe there is no monitoring going on, the occurrence will be higher. But so collecting audit logs that we'll talk about in different types, so that you have evidence, concrete evidence, it reduces the risk, greatly reduces the risk. And just a note on this is, as you are doing the collection, evidence inside of computer systems decays almost instantly. In the physical world, a fingerprint can stick around for a long time. And, we're talking microseconds, milliseconds, that type of frame when we're talking about computer science. So you have to collect the data and have a plan for collecting all the evidence long before there is actually an event. And so these are the things we're talking about. Logging, so system logs from firewalls and from firewalls and servers, so collecting all of that log management, both here at the firewall level and at the log management level. Signature-based events should also be collected. So you have basically log entries that need to be collected, so you can look at the log entries. The challenge with log entries are that they're highly processed, so they're not really data anymore. There's some level of information, and so those can be scrutinized in a court a lot easier than lower-level data. Full packet capture is exactly what it sounds like. It's collecting every packet, the header to the payload, and storing that. And then NetFlow is the metadata going across the interfaces that we discussed earlier. So really you have syslog, you have NetFlow, and you have PCAP to collect. And NetFlow is going to give you the breadth of seeing everything happening across the organization, the global organization. And PCAP is going to be at choke points. The benefit of NetFlow is breadth, and it's also data retention. You can keep it a lot longer, and when you need it, it's easier to query because the semantics of the NetFlow fields are known, so you can run queries quicker. And then, as needed, you would pivot down to PCAP. So these are the evidence sources that you want to keep in those audit trails. And so we've already hit on this, but when you look at NetFlow compared to PCAP, you might put a PCAP collector, somewhere around here. But you wouldn't see this guy talking to this guy or this guy talking to this guy. And this is, of course, about the simplest network diagram that could exist. So you can imagine all the different places you would have to put PCAP probes, the cost, and the rest, where you can instantly have visibility, and at least at the meta level, the logs for prosecution and investigations immediately. Further going down that line, talking about user attribution, because you can now monitor at the user level, and forgive the resolution of this and realize it's so blurry, but we can map on the conversations the actual usernames. And so now, instead of us monitoring computers, we're monitoring computers with their users, so we can run user level reports. Inside of StealthWatch, you can run a user snapshot to give a summary of everything a specific user has been doing across all of the machines they've been logged into. So, and coming close to time, but just want to go over a handful of points about Lancope and StealthWatch for those of you that aren't familiar. The company was founded in 2000 to do network behavioral anomaly detection. At the time, I was a network security officer at the Naval Postgraduate School. We were doing research. The research at Lancope was founded out of Georgia Tech. And for 15 years, we've been really the only primetime show for network behavioral anomaly detection, catching these insider threats, catching these sophisticated attacks, the zero-day threats, malware breakouts, providing forensic logging. The company has grown radically as the market has realized the importance of these threats. But again, we provide advanced detection, deep detection, so the east-west analysis, policy violation, and insider threats. So that is the company overview. We've already talked about this in different ways, but StealthWatch converts the network into the sensor. It's not about deploying more probes. There will not be a security tool that you'll deploy this year that will require less effort and give a quicker return than StealthWatch. It's, again, monitoring every device, every user, what they're doing, who they're communicating with, and providing detailed forensic records when needed. So this is know every host. So as a host is communicating on the network, StealthWatch creates a host profile. As we see a user, we create a user profile. And so we discover it because it was talking. We heard the communication, and we create that host profile. And we record every conversation to be used for investigative purposes when there is an incident, and we do know there's never a short of incidents. We baseline what is normal. What does normal manufacturing traffic look like? How do the plants communicate with headquarters? What is normal, so that we can alert to change when something aside from that occurs. And then, retention is massive. Many of our customers have 6 months or a year's worth of contextual information about their network, about the conversations that can be used to investigate. And when we're doing investigations, I was at a conference yesterday working through this, but an investigation needs to determine a couple of things, and one of them is the impact. So if a specific tool, maybe it's malware sandboxing like Cisco's FireAmp technology or an IPS solution, or maybe it's a third party, but when you become aware of an incident, you need to determine the impact of the incident. Machine A is infected. Okay, if machine A was infected at Monday, what did it do ahead of the infection? What was the impact of it? Right? Who did that host communicate with during the infection? And did it download data? Did it exfiltrate data? And so that's why that breadth of lateral conversation is so important. And then the other thing, aside from determining impact in an investigation, is determining the retro analysis. Is this the first time this has happened in the network, or is this a systematic, ongoing problem? Is this the only machine impacted by this, or do we have many across the globe? And so having access to all that data instantly, we can go back and resolve those questions. So the breakdown of the tools deploying, there's one SMC that handles all global reporting. There's a flow collector that's normally deployed per continent and global instances, and all the net flow is sent up to the flow collector. We have flow sensors to generate net flow where there's limited or poor net flow features on the route switch infrastructure. The flow replicator or UDP director can help send net flow to the StealthWatch flow collector and other tools. And then we also have integration with Cisco's Identity Services Engine and the StealthWatch ID box. So with that,